Tonight's learning is dedicated in the memory of Bilha Bas Deborah Abraham. We are starting now a mimer that is known by its opening two words, Vateh Tetzaveh, which happens to be this week's parsha. So this mimer occupies, as every mimer does, of course, a particular place, but this one has a certain special quality to it. This mimer was said by our Rebbe on a first Adar, it was a leap year, back in 1981. And then it was edited and prepared for print. Not every mimer that the Rebbe said, which was then written up by the team of scholars, was what is called in our parlance muga, edited by the Rebbe. This was edited and it was distributed by the Rebbe 30 years ago, this month, in Purim Katan, which we're going to commemorate next week, in 1992. Now, we know that less than 2 weeks later, the Rebbe suffered a stroke while at the oil. And of course, almost 2 years after that, was Gimel Tammuz when the Rebbe passed away. So this mimer occupies a very special place in the hearts and minds of Hasidim. It's the most recent mimer that the Rebbe distributed personally. And much like the Bas Lagani mimer that we talk about on the 10th of Shvat, which the previous Rebbe wrote in advance to be distributed on beginning on a Shabbos, and it turns out that he passed away on that Shabbos, and as such, that mimer is understood as his instruction for the Hasidim preparing for his physical departure. We attribute a similar character to this mimer in that it was the mimer that the Rebbe distributed personally, a booklet to thousands of men, women, and children shortly before the Rebbe took ill. And thus it was the last lesson that we received from the Rebbe. Now, as we have talked about in other contexts as well, our Rebbe, his form of delivering and teaching was distinct from the other Rebbes. Of course, every Rebbe has his particular way. And our Rebbe, his primary method for teaching was through the Farbrengen, held on Shabbos, on special occasions, Yontif, Chassidish, historical, Yomim Tovim, and special days. In addition, our Rebbe developed a certain particular way that was distinct, different than the other Rabbeim. If you look in the Maimarim of the other Rabbeim, let's say, for example, the fifth Rebbe, who is known as the Maimonides of Hasidus, because of the copious quantity of his teachings, he spoke what we call in the lingo is a hemshech. A hemshech means a continuum. That is, he would begin an idea, sometimes on Rosh Hashanah, and the same idea would be continued for months, maybe even more than a year, and thus published by the year. So in yeshiva language, you might say, what are you learning? And the person would answer with a year. I'm learning Tafresh Nun Tes, 56, 52, 59, or Tafresh Samach Vav, or Ayin Beis. Now that seems an odd thing. That's the name of a year. But the idea is that they are studying the continuum of essays written by the fifth Rebbe, or the sixth Rebbe, Tafshin Gimel, and so on. Our Rebbe had a very different style, format. Again, this is my understanding. In those Maimarim, it would begin with a question. And that question may never get a specific, particular answer. It's almost as if you have an idea, and to sort of be an introduction to the idea, the fifth Rebbe or the sixth Rebbe, all the previous Rebbes would begin with a question to sort of get your attention. And somewhere in the end, they give you the answer. But what was in between was really not linked exclusively to the question in pursuit of the answer, or certainly not as it appears to us. With our Rebbe, it was very different. Right from the beginning, and I can't say every single time, there were some exceptions, our Rebbe's Maimarim begin with an analysis of one of the previous Rebbe's Maimarim. It will summarize that lesson, and then it will analyze a few more points, questions, and those questions will in fact be answered by the end of the Maimer. So again, the Rebbe Rashab would have a continuous lesson that would go for a year, sometimes more. And our Rebbe's Maimarim begin with a reference to a previous Rebbe's Maimar, a quick summary, a series of questions, analysis, summary, and answer. So there's a beginning and an end in a relatively short number of pages. Now, the mimer that we are going to study, Vateh Tetzaveh, which I hope everybody was able to follow the link to get the original Hebrew or the translation. It's also published if you have the Hasidic Heritage series, and it's entitled Nurturing Faith, is based on a mimer from the previous Rebbe, Rav Yosef Yitzchak, the sixth Rebbe. And the circumstances of the sixth Rebbe's teaching of the original mimer, which what we are going to learn is an analysis of that mimer from our Rebbe. I hope the lingo here is clear. The original mimer also has a significant backstory that not only is just a curious historical fact, it also is informative about the character of the mimer itself. Because although Torah is truth under all circumstances, and although we tend to speak about Purim when it's Purim time and Sukkot when it's Sukkot time, the current events can also have an impact as to what the world needs to hear in that particular circumstance. And that is very much in play when we go back to the original mimer that we are basing this off of from the sixth Rebbe. The Frierdiker Rebbe in 1927 was a watched man. To skip ahead, in the summer of 1927, the previous Rebbe was in fact arrested, sentenced to death, which was then commuted to 12 years harsh labor, and ultimately on the 12th of Tammuz, which is his birthday, miraculously was released, to the point that he had to leave Russia. No one could get out, and they kicked him out. Now, just to reset the stage there, when we talk about communism, we're not discussing the economic system. That doesn't concern us. What we're talking about is the ruthless viciousness with which the communists in Russia sought out to destroy Torah. As an example, the night the previous Rebbe was arrested in the summer of 1927, there were 11 other clergymen who were arrested, other faiths and so on, because the communists hated everybody. And so they arrested 12 clergymen, lahavdil. The other 11 were shot in the back of the head that night. And again, we know this now, probably even more than they knew it at the time, that the communists killed more people than the Nazis. Why was the previous Rebbe the only rabbi who was arrested that night? Because all the other rabbis had fled Russia. When I had the opportunity, and I went to Russia about 14 years ago, we went to outside the apartment in St. Petersburg, 22 Malachivka Street, where the previous Rebbe was arrested in the middle of the night. There's a story there about how the Rebbe, who was not yet married to the Rebbitzin, they were only married in 1929, was coming, and the Rebbitzin called out from the window, "We have guests," which he understood what that meant. And the Rebbe immediately went back to where his apartment was to destroy any papers that could incriminate other Hasidim. When I say incriminate, could associate them with the teaching and dissemination of Hasidus. And in the fall or the winter of 1927, this time of year, on Purim Katan, it was also a leap year like this year, but that's the tone. That's the way I want people to sort of get that picture. The Frierdiker Rebbe had a Farbrengen in his apartment. Now, Farbrengens were all the things that the communists hated the most. First of all, it was assembly. And in their mind, any assembly was rebellion. People gathered because they were plotting to overthrow the government. We know about that paranoia. Second of all, they were teaching Torah. They certainly hated that. Third of all, at these Farbrengens, they would collect tzedakah because so many Hasidim were stripped of their jobs because they wouldn't work on Shabbos. And since the government controlled everything, and if you didn't work on Shabbos, your kids didn't go to school on Saturday, they could take away your job. And it wasn't like you could go through the want ads and find another job. I mean, it was a prison camp. We forget, or we might forget, what communism meant. And again, I'm not talking about the economic system. That's not our concern at this point. And the Frierdiker Rebbe is having a Farbrengen, Purim Katan, 1927. And they know that there are spies, they're being watched. In the big shul that Chabad now runs, it's 150 years old in St. Petersburg, literally across the street is a KGB building. Because on paper, communism is wonderful. Everyone can do whatever they want. Sure, of course, freedom and so on. Paper, it's wonderful. But in practice, it was very, very horrible. So the Chassidim were very nervous. You know, the Frierdiker Rebbe is attracting a lot of attention. But he's the Rebbe, so what are you going to do? Tell him what to do? But there were some older Hasidim, and they were like, Rebbe, you know, the people downstairs are going to call the police. And the Frierdiker Rebbe said, don't worry so much about what's below you, worry more about what is above you. At one point, they tried to get his mother, the Rebbetzin Shterna Sarah, who lived with them and later came to the United States. She's buried near the oil. And she passed away when 80 years ago, last month, when the previous Rebbe was here in Chicago. They tried to get her, but she knew what it meant to be a Rebbe and so on, so she didn't interfere. And they're at this Farbrengen, Purim Katan, 1927. The Frierdiker Rebbe said a mimer based on this week's Parsha's opening line. This mimer that our Rebbe in 1981 elaborated on, and in 1992, 30 years ago, next week, the Rebbe personally distributed, stood for hours. Every man, woman, child who wanted to could file past the Rebbe and receive this mimer in their hand as a booklet, and of course the intent being that they should learn it. So, and again, 2 weeks after that, the Rebbe took ill, and this is that we hold on to. Now, the mimer is based on the opening line of this week's parsha. This week's parsha is probably most well known for it being the only parsha since the birth of Moshe Rabbeinu until the book of Devarim, which is all the final instruction of Moshe Rabbeinu, that does not contain Moshe Rabbeinu's name in it at all. You will not find Moshe mentioned, his name mentioned at all in the entire parsha. Now, this, of course, caught our attention. What is the backstory? Why is it that Moshe's name is not mentioned at all in the parsha? So it's actually based on a story, ironically, or curiously, that occurs in next week's parsha. In next week's parsha, we're going to read about the tragedy of the golden calf. Everyone remembers the story that Moshe Rabbeinu tells Aaron and Hur, their nephew, the son of Miriam, and the elders, that he, Moshe, is going up the mountain, and he's going to receive the luchos, the tablets, and they should mind the store in the meantime. The people become impatient. They clamor to build a golden calf, and they do. And when Moshe Rabbeinu comes down and he sees the golden calf, he smashes the luchos, and now he has to deal with two issues. One is the reprimand of the Jewish people, and the other is the wrath of Hashem. And at one point, Hashem says to him, that's it, Moshe, I've had it. I'm wiping them out, and I'm starting over with you. I'm starting a brand new community, and I'm starting over from you. And Moshe says to Hashem, do not do that. And if you do, erase my name from your book. I don't want to be part of it. So Hashem, so to speak, capitulates and says to Moshe, okay, you win, just to play out the story, but I'm not going to be amongst them. I'll send an angel. Then we said, what can we do to make you amongst us? God says, make me a sanctuary and I'll dwell amongst each of them. So the Gemara tells us that since Moshe Rabbeinu said, erase my name from your book, even though Hashem capitulated, meaning Moshe made a condition, if you're going to destroy the Jewish people, then I don't want any part of it. I want you to erase my name from your book. So even though Hashem said, I won't I won't destroy the Jewish people, and therefore the condition is not to be fulfilled, that Moshe's name is not erased from Torah. However, since Moshe said it, his name is erased from one parsha in the Torah, and that is this week's parsha. Which, of course, leads to a whole series of further questions. Why this parsha? Especially since the story didn't even happen yet. The story only happens in next week's parsha. So why is this parsha chosen to be the parsha? So, as many explain, this is not a punishment for Moshe. On the contrary, it's an illustration of the infinite influence of Moshe. How do we see that? Because although Moshe's name is not mentioned in the parsha, Moshe is front and center throughout the parsha. As evidence from the very first word of the whole parsha is, quote, and you should command the Jewish people. Who is this pronoun you a reference to? Obviously, it's Moshe. And as we point out, it's so obviously Moshe that he doesn't need to have his name mentioned. It's like if your child calls up and says, hello, you don't say, who is this? You know who it is. You don't need the introduction. An introduction, a name in that context would be almost a form of separation, as if you don't know who this person is. And therefore, Moshe Rabbeinu's name being absent is an illustration of how aligned Moshe is with Hashem, as we see from the story that Moshe, was able to save the Jewish people, change Hashem's plan, et cetera, as we discussed. As such, as we'll see exploring in the Maimer, and again, with the background that we understand the Frierdiker Rebbe was living in this precarious moment, and the people were terrified that he was going to be arrested. And he was not that night, but he was in fact a few months later arrested and sentenced to death. And the Frierdiker Rebbe writes in his diary that he thought he was going to be killed. He was brutalized and beaten physically, tormented and tortured, and he was scared for his life. Through a miracle, he was released, but he had to leave the Chassidim. He had to leave Russia. Our Rebbe distributed this mimer, and 2 weeks later, although we still had the blessing of the Rebbe's physical presence for another 2 years, the communication was taken away. So this idea that Moshe is not mentioned in the parsha, that this mimer begins, as we'll explore in the mimer, helps give us an insight into what is described as the difference between power and influence. Power is what I can make you do. The teacher can make the students behave because the teacher has the power to pass or fail. The employer can make the employee comply because the employer has the power to pay him or fire him. The influence means I have no power. He doesn't pay your salary. He doesn't pass or fail you. A person who has power, they lose the power. The kid graduates, the teacher has no power. The employee gets another job, the employer has no power. But a person who has influence, like a tzaddik, who doesn't pass or fail you, doesn't let you into the synagogue or not let you into the synagogue, he has only influence, not power. That is eternal. And then this is what we're starting to get a glimpse of, and as we'll see it discussed and explored in the Maimer, how Moshe Rabbeinu's Moshe Rabbeinu's influence is more profound when his name is not mentioned than when his name is mentioned. You know, it's the classic thing. The policeman comes by and he says, why do you say this crime? I've been standing here all day and there's no crime. Well, of course, you've been standing here all day. That's why there's no crime. As soon as your name is not present, the crime returns. As soon as Moshe Rabbeinu's name is not front and center, we get to see whether he has power or he has influence. In addition, we will learn about what it means to be in a relationship between the teacher and the student, the leader and the community. Is the community simply obedient to the leader? Or is there something that the community gifts to the leader? Does the leader have a personal transformation? Or is he just a nice guy? I mean, being a leader is a big nuisance. Why should I spend time teaching? I'd rather study myself. Why should I spend time mentoring? I'd rather pursue my own interests. So we say, well, don't be so self-centered and be kind and giving and mentor somebody else. Yeah, it's true that you're going to take away from your studies. You're going to take away from your pursuit of your opportunity. You should still do it because it's the nice thing to do. That's one attitude. Another attitude that we're going to learn about is the manner in which the teacher, the mentor, is enriched by the community. Just earlier this week, Rebbetzin Chava Hecht passed away. Her husband was Rabbi J.J. Hecht, the brother of Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Hecht, who was here in Chicago. Rabbi J.J. Hecht and his whole family had, for their generation, a unique relationship with the Rebbe. They were American-born, which was pretty unusual for that age group. Most of their contemporaries were still born in Europe and Russia. So they had a certain feel for the American character. And Rabbi J.J. Hecht, who was a great chassid, had a certain relationship with the Rebbe that was had a certain American style, a little less formal style. And he once said to the Rebbe in this sort of joking way, he said, I have no Rahmanis on the Rebbe. The Rebbe can do it all. And the Rebbe said to him in an uncharacteristically serious tone, the Rebbe can only do with what the Hasidim give him. They only have the power that the Hasidim give to the Rebbe. So the relationship, the dynamic between the leader and the led is going to be not only one way that the leader gives to the led, and we're so lucky that Moshe Rabbeinu teaches us, it's that Moshe Rabbeinu is enriched by his relationship with the Jewish people, as we will explore. Now, some, like in all Maimarim, you have certain lingo, you have a certain style, and you have certain passages that really only resonate in the original biblical Hebrew. So we'll do our best to try to point out the real particular nuance of the specific wording. And I've only muted everybody because sometimes there's some background noise. On the contrary, not only is it permissible, it's encouraged that people want to take to unmute themselves, but just make sure you unmute yourself. You don't have to raise your hand, just unmute yourself and jump in with a question. So again, I sent out an email and on the WhatsApp and so on, a link to the English translation and to the original Hebrew. I wasn't able to find anything online that's both in the same link. So, whatever you're able to follow. Okay, so here we go. Shabbos Parshas Tetzaveh, Yud Adar Rishon Hey Tav Shem Emal. So again, this Maimer, which is from our Rebbe, an analysis of a Maimer from the previous Rebbe, was taught on the 10th of Adar 1. Today is 8 now, going into the 9th. So Friday will be the 10th of Adar 1. That year it was a Shabbos in 1981, so 41 years ago. And it begins with the opening line of our parsha. Vateh, and you, Tetzaveh, should command, Es B'nai Yisrael, the children of Israel, V'yikchu Elecha, and they should bring to you shemen, oil, zayis of olive, zach, crushed, zach, pure, kassis, crushed, lamaor. Now, this is, again, an important nuance that's hard to communicate in English. In English, we use the word light to refer to the light source, the fixture, and the light that's emanated. In Hebrew, there's two words. The or is the light. The source of that light, the lamp or the light fixture, is the ma'or with the mem prefix. So the pasuk says that this olive oil that is pure and crushed is for the ma'or, the source of light. Lahalois, to raise up, ner tamid, a constant flame. Now it's important to remember that in the Mishkan, which is the time that this pasuk is talking about, later in the Beis Hamikdash, of course, they did not have what we think of in our shuls. We don't have it in Beis Menachem, but in other shuls, a ner tamid. They don't have a ner tamid. That is just a lamp up in the front. There's nothing against it, but that when we say a ner tamid here, we don't mean a separate light that is burning all the time. It's a reference to the menorah, which again in this verse is described as a constant light. Now, as so often happens in analysis of Torah, we take this pasuk, seems perfectly harmless, and we begin to pick it apart and look at every detail and every nuance. So again, remember the context. The pronoun you, which is the first word, and later where it says they should bring to you this pure olive oil crushed for the luminary, is distinctive to Moshe. That pronoun is a reference to Moshe. So, as our Rebbe often does, he begins by summarizing, in this case it's the Frierdiker Rebbe, the sixth Rebbe's analysis and essay of this mimer, and gives us a quick summary and then some more questions. So I'll try to do my best English rendition. I'll try to be as true to the real rigid Hebrew reading as I can. And of course, throwing in some other explanations the best as I possibly can. And as I said before, just unmute yourself and jump in with a question at any point. Now, the Rebbe says, we have already established certain close readings in this pasuk that raise other points. You know, it's not unlike a detective who runs their finger across the circumstance and looks for something that it might catch on, looks for something out of the ordinary. Is there some anomaly that raises our attention? Say, oh, okay, there's something here for us to discover. There's something here that I have to look into. So this is what we're looking for now. What is the first point that we make here that seems out of line, unanticipated? That all other commandments in Torah are described as Hashem telling Moshe to then, and here's, I'll read the Hebrew, Tzav es b'nei Yisrael, instruct the Jewish people. You recognize this formula. Hashem speaks to Moshe, telling Moshe to relay to the Jewish people whatever the mitzvah may be. Vayidaber Hashem al Moshe, Lamor, God says to Moshe, this is what you should say. Tzav es b'nei Yisrael, command the Jewish people. Daber el b'nei Yisrael, tell the Jewish people, whatever it is. God directs Moshe to command the Jewish people. But here, it doesn't say that. Let's go back to the opening line. The opening line says, and you, and again, the you is a reference to Moshe, and why his name isn't mentioned, etc., as we discussed, you should command the children of Israel. So what does that mean? Moshe is not the commander. Moshe is the agent to relay the command, and the commander is Hashem. Just a brief aside, there was a man, he's passed away, his name was David Chase, and he was a very significant supporter of Chabad. If you've ever been to the yeshiva in Morristown, the campus is named for him. And he also developed a close personal relationship with the Rebbe. He spearheaded the Machne Yisrael Development Fund, the reconstruction and expansion of 770, and so on. And he once said to the Rebbe that we're an army and the Rebbe is the commander-in-chief. And the Rebbe said, Hashem is the commander-in-chief. So Moshe is not the commander. He doesn't create the commandments. He doesn't issue the commandments. He simply, not so simply, but he relays the commandments. And yet the pasuk says, again, the opening line, and you, Moshe, should command the Jewish people. Me? No, I don't command. I just tell them what you said. That's one. In addition, this precise point, this anomaly, this that the pasuk says, and you should command, is not only an anomaly in the phraseology, that it seems like out of whack. Why is Moshe described as the commander? Is it Moshe the agent of command, of God's command, and so on? But ultimately, it's God's commandment. Here, the Rebbe points out, it's not only that the grammar doesn't seem to work, but the concept doesn't. That when it says, and you should command, it suggests that Moshe is in fact the commander, as if Moshe made it up on his own. And this requires investigation. Moshe is the agent to transmit to the Jewish people the commandment of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Why does it say that you, Moshe, should be the commander? Oh, so now all of a sudden, this nice simple verse has caught our attention. There must be something more going on here. Not so fast, or there's more yet to come. Next question. We also have to pursue an understanding. Why does the pasuk require Moshe to instruct the Jewish people to bring him, Moshe, the olive oil? Why? The verse says, if you look back in the top verse, they should bring it to you, this olive oil pure crushed for the luminary. The lighting of the menorah is not Moshe Rabbeinu's purview. The lighting of the menorah is the purview of Aaron, Moshe's brother. Why would they have to bring the oil to Moshe first? Moshe doesn't have to check it. Let him bring it to Aaron. Now, it's important that we also remember, worthwhile to review, that the Moshe-Aaron dynamic of relationship with the Jewish people is twofold. They each serve a different style. Moshe is the one who brings Torah to the people. Moshe comes down the mountain with the Torah. And Aaron is the one who brings the people up to Hashem. Moshe, Torah Tziva Lanu Moshe. Moshe is the teacher. And Aaron is the one who gets you out of trouble. He brings the karbonos. He raises up. And lighting of the menorah is in the purview of Aaron. It was his responsibility, first and foremost. And it is in genre, the contextual concept of Aaron, the action, more than the judicial academic that's associated with Moshe. So the question on the table is, why is it necessary for the Jewish people to bring Moshe the oil? Just bring it right to Aaron. Why does he have to bring it to Moshe? Next, we also require some analysis that it says, again, oil crushed for the ma'or. Now, the word ma'or, as we talked about, in English, it's hard to describe it. They translate it as a luminary, which is not a word that we commonly use. But the ma'or is the source of the light. Meaning, it's the old joke, what do you put in the toaster? Most people say toast. You don't put toast in the toaster. You put bread in the toaster. You don't have light to light up the light. The light is to light up the room. I don't have a light fixture, in this case, a menorah, to light up the menorah. I have the menorah to light up the room around me. So why does it say in the pasuk that the purpose of this pure olive oil crushed is for the ma'or, for the source of light, for the light fixture, for the menorah? Seemingly, it should have said, bring you olive oil crushed, lahoyer, to light up the room. That seems to be the purpose of it. And then we have another issue. We read in the opening pasuk that this light is described as a ner tamid, a constant light. And yet there's the pasuk that follows it immediately thereafter in our parsha reads that the lights were burning and arranged for evening until morning. So evening till morning is not constant. In the first pasuk of the parsha, it's this week's parsha, the lights are described as a ner tamid, a constant light. In the second pasuk of the parsha, the lights are described as being from evening until morning. Well, that means in the morning they go out. That's not constant. So we got a couple of questions here. And this is one of the beautiful things that we always do in Torah. We take this pasuk, it seems nice and harmless, and everybody can live with it, move on, and not so fast. This pasuk that seems like it makes perfect sense, it doesn't seem to make any sense at all. So our basic questions are, and as I mentioned, in our Rebbe's Maimarim, by the time we get to the end of this Maimer, it's not really that long. I mean, the English translation takes a little bit longer and the notes and so on, but it's not really that long. By the time we get to the end of this Maimer, we will answer each of these questions. So it's significant for us to have those questions in mind, because this is not just a way to sort of get our mind sparked and going. It is actually our objective to get hard answers to these questions. Question number one, why does the pasuk phrase it that Moshe is the commander? Isn't Hashem the commander and Moshe, quote, only, end quote, the transmitter of the command? Two, why do they have to bring the oil to Moshe, which is sort of a 1A? And then, why does the pasuk, or the two verses, first refer to this light as being constant, 24 hours, and then, oh, evening till morning. Which one is it? Chapter 2. So the Rebbe summarized this, and he says, now, this has been explained already by who the Rebbe refers to as my father-in-law, that is the Rebbe's father-in-law, the previous Rebbe, the Frierdiker Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak. He already explained this in a mimer that he spoke in a Farbrengen on Purim Katan, this will be referenced, in 1927. And again, we reference what the political circumstance was like then. And that mimer began with a different opening line. It began with the line that's a quote from the Megillah that reads that the Jewish people accepted upon themselves at Purim what they had begun, what they had pledged to do at Sinai. Now, I want to jump in here, even though in this mimer, our Rebbe doesn't summarize that mimer, but there is certainly relevant information from that mimer that applies here. Now, in that mimer, the previous Rebbe quotes the statement in the Talmud. In the Megillah, and again, it was said on Purim Katan, so we don't read the Megillah on Purim Katan, but we do think about it. In the Megillah, it says that the Jewish people accepted upon themselves that which they began. Now, the Gemara elaborates that when Esther wrote that, she was alluding to a new stage in the Jewish people's relationship with Hashem. And that stage consisted of the affirmation of what the Jewish people committed themselves to that they had begun at Sinai. Now, remember, Purim happens 1,000 years after Sinai. So it's a long time later. And this seems to suggest, the previous Rebbe talks about in this other mimer, that somehow something more profound, a deeper connection with Hashem, was effectuated on Purim, or as a result of the story of Purim, even more profound in contrast to the experience at Har Sinai, at Mount Sinai, when the Jewish people announced, we will do whatever it is, we don't even know what it is, but we're committed to doing it. So the previous Rebbe in that mimer, which this piece that we're discussing is pulled out of that mimer, the previous Rebbe asks what we call an obvious question, a klutz kasha. He says, when the Jewish people declare to Hashem that we will do and then we will understand, meaning whatever it is, we're in. This was at the most profound spiritual experience in history. God had revealed themselves. The mountain held over their head. There was intense spirituality. They were out in the wilderness. They were sustained miraculously by the manna. How could we possibly say that the Jewish people in the time of Purim, when, first of all, they're not even living in the land of Israel, they're living outside of Israel. Second of all, they're under a threat of total annihilation. They're in the seemingly least godly of circumstances, and yet we want to declare that the commitment of Purim was greater than the commitment
Bob Pack Sales, SALES, with WITH power.com. It looks like you're on mute.
Hold on. How's this? Is this any better? Can you hear me?
Yep, that's good.
Okay, I don't know what happened here.
Yeah.
Pods. I don't know what happened. Okay, I'll just leave it here. Can you hear me? Yes, okay. Sorry, I don't know, the ear pods technology is the end of us all. Okay, so let's at least continue here. So in that mimer, I don't know where we got cut off, but in the mimer that the previous Rebbe was teaching, when in the midst of it, he taught this idea, he spoke about the contrast of the Jewish people when they were at Sinai and seemingly at the loftiest and most spiritually sensitive of times, in contrast to Purim when they were seemingly in the most downtrodden of times because they were being abused and indulged and so on. And yet we describe the Purim experience as evoking a more profound relationship with Hashem than the spiritual luxury of Sinai. And that's going to be a theme that we're going to revisit in this mimer. We're going to see that here again. Now, the Frierdiker Rebbe begins his sort of, okay, now that we got all these questions, and what we like to do is come up with one thematic answer and follow it straight down the line and come up with an all-inclusive new perspective that allows everything to fall into place. So he begins by reorienting us around the primary line or the primary word in the parsha, which the word in Hebrew is Tetzaveh, the name of this week's parsha. And we commonly, you look it up in the dictionary, it translates as command. You, that is Moshe, should command. So the Frierdiker Rebbe now points out that this word Tetzaveh, this word for commandment, doesn't just mean an instruction that Hashem tells us to do something. It also means, and this is, we discussed this in Tanya, an opportunity to become bonded and connected with the commander. Now you recall in Tanya, in one of the late 40s in the chapter, 47, 48, I forget, maybe, the Alter Rebbe talks about how a king offers an opportunity to a person who is completely isolated socially, economically, and in every other way, and the king comes to him and gives him an opportunity to be bonded and unified with the king. This evokes a connection and a bond between him and the king. We know this even at a less dramatic level, whenever we're able to work together with people, even if we don't always get along with them, but the fact that we work together creates a union amongst the people with the common mission. So now we're going back into the opening line and says, and you, Moshe, should command the Jewish people it doesn't just mean you should command them, tell them when to stand up and sit down. It also means you should empower them to have a union, a connection, a bond with Hashem. And we point out that grammatically, the word tzivoy, tzav, mitzvah, tetzaveh, that's the root word, tzav, tzadik vav, is from the same word that is tzavtza, chibor, unification. In fact, time and time again, we find so many words in Hebrew mean to bond, to unify. God created the world, God was single. He created a whole world that appears to be disparate, and our job is to illustrate that singularity. And this is what it means. And you, then, Moshe, should now, we're going to read it not just as command, but you should unify, you should join, you should bind the Jewish people, meaning that the role of Moshe is to connect and unify the Jewish people with the infinite light of Hashem. So, you think about this as a parent, a teacher, a mentor. What is your primary role? And what we see here is the primary role is to evoke from the child, the student, the mentee, that they should be bonded with their objective. In this case, of course, it's Hashem. But whatever the format is of teaching, the objective is that the teacher, the instructor, the leader should connect the student, child, etc., with their essential character and identity. Help them to discover their essential relationship with Hashem. This is a classic thing that we see socially in Chabad. People say, why is Chabad successful? What do they give people that others can't give them? And the answer is, we don't give them anything. We only allow them to discover what is innately theirs. It's not that we come and say, okay, here's something that you didn't know you have, and now we're going to give it to you. Because every salesman will be upstaged by the next guy selling the next mousetrap or better AirPods that don't knock out on you in the middle. So we're not here to give somebody something as much as we are to evoke from within that person their innate connection. Now, through Moshe, he brings about this quality amongst the Jewish people, that he bonds them with the infinite light of Hashem. And this adds and increases Moshe. Moshe becomes enriched thereby. And this will be a theme that we will explore in the pages ahead. We'll stop here. Just a reminder that this Motzoi Shabbos, we're hosting Rabbi Plotkin, a special